I am Maya, 33 years old, and I spent my entire life pretending to be the quiet, invisible sister, just to keep the peace. As an IT consultant, I fixed every problem while swallowing their daily insults. Last Thanksgiving, my family thought they had finally broken me completely. Between slices of turkey and forced smiles, my brother-in-law handed me a legal document to sign away my inheritance and estate, while my parents cheered him on. They called me a single computer fixing failure who was standing in the way of real wealth and social prestige. I just smiled, took a sip of my iced tea, and flatly refused. I had no idea they were about to legally evict me from my own home within 24 hours. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in an affluent neighborhood in Atlanta, our family was completely obsessed with outward appearances. My father Thomas was a prominent reverend, and my mother Evelyn treated our social standing like a religion of its own. To the congregation, we were the perfect black family. To me, our home was a suffocating theater where my younger sister Chloe always played the leading lady. That Thanksgiving dinner felt like a perfectly orchestrated trap. The dining room table was beautifully set with crystal glasses and a massive roasted turkey, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. I was quietly eating my food, ignoring the way Chloe was flaunting her new diamond bracelet when Julian made his move. Julian was the husband of Chloe, a smooth-talking finance vice president who managed the investment accounts. He leaned across the table, a smug smile plastered across his face, and slid a thick legal document directly over my dinner plate. The heavy paper landed right on top of my food. "Sign away your rights to the estate," Maya Julian commanded, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Chloe and I are bringing in the bulldozers next week. We are tearing down that old shack to build luxury condos. It is a massive deal, and your name is the only thing holding up the permits." The entire table went completely silent. My parents stopped eating and watched me expectantly, waiting for me to yield as I always did. Big Mama was my grandmother, the only person who had ever truly loved me without conditions. When she passed away, she left her historic property to me, knowing I would cherish it. I looked down at the document, then back up at Julian. I did not cry, and I did not shake. I reached for my linen napkin, calmly wiped my mouth, and pushed the papers back across the table, leaving a grease stain on the front page. "I am not signing anything, Julian," I said, keeping my voice completely steady. "Big Mama left that land to me because she knew its history. It is not some empty lot for you to flip so you can buy Chloe another sports car. That house is mine." The calm in my voice seemed to ignite a match. My mother Evelyn slammed her wine glass down on the table so hard the crystal nearly shattered. Red wine sloshed over the rim and stained the white tablecloth. "You are 33 years old, single and fixing computers for a living," Evelyn yelled, her face contorting with pure rage. "Julian is a vice president of finance. He actually understands how the real world works. We need this real estate deal to secure the family legacy. You are being completely selfish, just like you were when you refused to marry the deacon's son 5 years ago." Her words were meant to cut deeply, to remind me of my supposed failures. My mother had never forgiven me for rejecting a loveless marriage that would have elevated her status at the country club. She saw my career in cybersecurity, which she dismissed as just fixing computers, as an absolute embarrassment. I looked at my mother, absorbing the venom in her voice. "What legacy are we protecting, Mom? The one where we bulldoze our own history to make Julian richer? I work hard for what I have, and I do not need a husband to validate my existence." Chloe chimed in, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, Maya. You are just jealous because Julian is successful and you are stuck in a dead-end job. Just sign the paper so we can all move on. You do not even have the money to maintain that property anyway." My father Thomas finally spoke, his deep voice echoing with the strict authority he usually reserved for his sermons. "Your mother and your sister are right, Maya. You need to stop being so difficult. We are a family, and family supports each other. Julian and his project are going to bring immense prestige to our name. I stared at the people who were supposed to protect me, realizing they saw me only as an obstacle to their endless greed. I will not let you destroy Big Mama and her house. I repeated, my tone final and unwavering. You can yell and insult me all you want, but my signature is legally required and you are never getting it. Julian let out a loud, mocking laugh that sent a sharp chill down my spine. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a second document, slapping it down on the table with a victorious smirk. It really does not matter if you sign this or not, Maya, Julian said, his eyes gleaming with pure malice. Your father already used his power of attorney to transfer the deed to my firm this morning. We do not need your permission anymore. You have exactly 24 hours to leave the property. The room stayed dead silent. I did not give them a reaction. Instead, I picked up my phone and typed a single message to my chief operations officer. The message said to execute Protocol Delta immediately. I locked the screen and placed the phone down. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Who did you just text, Maya? He asked with a sneer. Let me guess. You are scrambling to find some discount lawyer. Do you really think a public defender is going to stop a powerhouse like Vanguard Capital? We manage billions of dollars every day. We crush people like you before breakfast. My mother, Evelyn, nodded along with him, her face glowing with twisted pride. Stop embarrassing yourself, Maya, she said, waving her wine glass at me. Just pack your bags and go quietly. You never understood how real business works. Julian is a highly respected vice president of finance. You fix routers for small businesses. It is time to bow down to the adults and accept your place. I took a deliberate sip of my water, letting the silence stretch out. I let them bask in their false superiority for a few more seconds. Vanguard Capital. I said the name clearly, making sure every single syllable carried weight. The exact same Vanguard Capital that finalized a massive buyout from Obsidian Tech Holding last Thursday. Julian immediately stopped laughing. A confused and panicked frown appeared on his face. How do you know about that buyout? He demanded, his voice dropping an octave. That information is highly confidential. Only top executives and the acquiring board members know the details. The merger has not even been announced to the public yet. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a sleek, matte black business card and slid it across the smooth mahogany table. It stopped on top of the cruel eviction notice he had just tried to force on me. Pick it up, Julian. I suggested, keeping my gaze locked directly on his eyes. He reached for the card with a hesitant hand. His eyes scanned the raised silver foil lettering. I watched as his face drained of all color until he looked like he had just seen a ghost. His hand started shaking so violently that the card slipped from his fingers and fluttered back onto the table. What does it say, Julian? Chloe demanded, leaning over to grab it. Her jaw dropped open as she read the words aloud. Maya Hayes, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Obsidian Tech Holding. This is a fake, Chloe shrieked. She tried to tear the card, but the thick premium material would not rip. You printed this online to try and scare us. You are just a computer repair girl. You do not own a multi-billion-dollar holding company. I turned my attention fully to my sister. I built a massive cybersecurity firm from the ground up while you were busy failing out of design school in Paris. The exact same Paris trip you funded by convincing Mom and Dad to secretly drain my college savings account. I built proprietary threat intelligence software that 50 of the top Fortune 500 companies rely on today. And last week, my board of directors approved the total acquisition of Vanguard Capital. That means Julian does not just work for Obsidian Tech. He works directly for me. Julian swallowed hard. The arrogant, commanding posture he had maintained all evening completely collapsed. He slumped back into his dining chair, looking like a deflated balloon. Maya, he stammered. His voice was suddenly high-pitched and desperate. We can talk about this like rational adults. We are family, after all. I was just following orders from the senior partners regarding the estate development. I swear to you, it was not personal. It became highly personal the exact moment you tried to steal my grandmother's legacy, I replied. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. But the real issue today is your recent financial activity, Julian. You see, when Obsidian Tech acquires a new firm, we run a deep forensic audit on all top executives. It is standard cybersecurity procedure to ensure there are no liabilities. We found something very interesting in your personal files. What files? Julian asked. Sweat was now visibly forming on his forehead and tracking down his temples. The encrypted files showing you illegally transferring Vanguard client funds into offshore accounts, I said. The exact amount was $5 million. You tried to mask it as a series of bad trades and market fluctuations, but my software traced every single digital footprint right back to your personal IP address. You committed corporate theft and wire fraud. Julian was gasping for air as if the room had suddenly run out of oxygen. Chloe looked back and forth between us, completely terrified by the sudden shift in power. As the founder and chief executive officer of your new parent company, I am officially terminating your employment at Vanguard Capital effective immediately, I announced. My voice was calm, but it cut through the room like a sharp blade. You are fired for gross misconduct, conflict of interest, and embezzlement. Security is currently clearing out your office and locking down all your corporate accounts. You will be hearing from my corporate lawyers in the morning regarding the stolen $5 million. Julian buried his face in his hands, weeping. Chloe started screaming that I was ruining her life and destroying her future. My mother sat frozen, unable to comprehend that I was now a billionaire CEO, holding their entire future in the palm of my hand. But the true shock came from the end of the table. My father Thomas slammed both his fists down on the dining table. The silver and china rattled loudly against the wood. "You fired your sister's husband," he roared. "Have you lost your absolute mind, Maya?" I stared at him unflinchingly. "He is a thief, Dad. He stole millions of dollars from his own firm. Do you expect me to keep a criminal on my payroll just because he married Chloe? You do not understand what you have just done," my father yelled. Julian desperately needed that vice president position today, Maya. The silence that followed the confession from my father was heavier than the humid Atlanta air outside. Bankrupting the church was a line nobody ever crossed, especially not the pastor himself. My mother stood up, her manicured hands trembling as she pointed a finger directly at my face. She told me I was a disgrace to the entire Black community. She claimed the congregation would despise me, that the elderly women who baked me cookies when I was a little girl would curse my name for stripping away their retirement savings. My father paced the length of the dining room, his booming preacher voice vibrating against the crystal chandelier. He painted a picture of absolute ruin, telling me that the media would crucify us, and that the legacy he built over 40 years of Sunday sermons would be completely destroyed by his own spiteful daughter. I sat perfectly still, watching the people who raised me attempt to weaponize the community against me, just to protect a wealthy white man who had lied to their faces. Julian saw my parents turning the tide and immediately seized the opportunity to regain his footing. He straightened his tie, brushed a piece of lint off his expensive lapel, and let out a scoff. He told me that firing him was a cute power play, but ultimately a massive mistake. With a sickeningly sweet tone, he reminded me that he had friends at every major financial news outlet in the country. He threatened to call his contacts at the Wall Street Journal and Forbes before the turkey was even cold. Julian promised to run a relentless smear campaign against Obsidian Tech, leaking fabricated stories about data breaches and unstable management. He swore he would tank my company valuation and make sure no legitimate investor would ever touch my firm again. He leaned over the table, invading my personal space, and whispered that nobody would believe a bitter single Black woman over a highly connected finance executive. I did not flinch or break eye contact with him. Instead, I leaned forward, matching his aggressive posture. I asked him if his smear campaign would be as thorough as the one he and Chloe ran against me 10 years ago. I turned my attention directly to my sister, who suddenly looked very interested in her plate. I reminded them both loud enough for my parents to hear how they had forged my signature and smeared my name to the Federal College Loan Board. They had convinced the loan officers that I had dropped out, causing my remaining tuition funds to be redirected straight into a joint account they controlled. Chloe had used every single cent of my hard-earned educational money to fund a luxurious study abroad program in Paris. She abandoned the program after 3 weeks, choosing instead to spend my tuition on designer handbags and expensive wine. I spent the next 5 years working 3 jobs just to pay off the debt they saddled me with. My mother tried to interrupt, claiming that was ancient history, but I raised my hand and silenced her instantly. Ancient history is just data waiting to be uncovered, I told them, pulling my tablet from my leather bag. I tapped the screen 3 times, bypassing the complex biometric security I had personally coded. I connected my device directly to the massive 80-inch smart television mounted on the dining room wall. Julian realized exactly what I was doing and lunged across the table to stop me, knocking over a gravy boat and shattering 2 wine glasses in his frantic desperation. He screamed at my father to unplug the television, claiming I was trying to upload a virus to the home network. But he was too late. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the dim dining room with the stark, glaring light of raw financial truth. I had used my top-tier security clearance to pull a complete forensic accounting of every single dollar that had passed through his hands over the last 48 months. Rows of bank statements, wire transfers, and encrypted ledger entries scrolled rapidly across the screen before stopping on a heavily highlighted document. I narrated the data for my parents, keeping my voice as clinical as a courtroom prosecutor. I pointed out the exact date my father authorized transferring the church pension fund to the luxury condo project belonging to Julian. Then I showed them where the money actually went. The funds never touched a construction account or a real estate holding firm. Julian routed the entire pension fund through 3 different shell companies before dumping it directly into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He drained the church dry to pay off the astronomical credit card debts belonging to Chloe. The screen displayed her itemized purchases, including a mortgaged sports car, private yacht charters, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-end jewelry. My parents stared at the television in absolute horror, the undeniable proof of the golden child and her greed staring right back at them. The air was sucked out of the room as my father read the highlighted numbers out loud, his voice breaking with devastation. Julian tried to stammer an excuse, claiming the offshore accounts were just a temporary tax strategy, but nobody was listening to him anymore. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy lifestyle had just been violently shattered. Realizing that the undeniable truth was displayed in high definition for everyone to see, Chloe deployed her ultimate defense mechanism. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling shriek and suddenly collapsed onto the hardwood floor. She curled into a tight ball, clutching her stomach with both hands and crying hysterically. My baby Chloe screamed, her face twisting in agony. "Maya, you are stressing me out. You are killing my baby." The financial fraud was instantly forgotten. My mother dropped to her knees beside Chloe, weeping, while my father frantically grabbed his phone, screaming at me to call an ambulance. The chaotic blur of ambulance sirens and flashing red lights did nothing to drown out the relentless accusations hurled at me. I drove my car behind them, carefully navigating toward the emergency room. The moment the sliding doors parted, Julian was already putting on a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. He paced the waiting area, running his hands through his hair, ensuring every nurse noticed his distress. My mother and father flanked him, creating a physical barricade. Evelyn hissed that I was completely forbidden from stepping near her daughter. My father crossed his arms, demanding I leave before I caused a miscarriage. I did not retreat. I stood by the vending machines, watching Julian approach the nursing station. He leaned over the counter, adopting the tone of a desperate husband. He loudly informed the staff that his pregnant wife was in Trauma Bay 3 because his unstable sister-in-law had launched a vicious psychological attack. He painted a tragic picture, portraying me as a deranged spinster trying to harm his unborn child. He requested security, claiming I was prone to violent outbursts. The nurses exchanged sympathetic glances, offering soothing words, completely buying into his white knight persona. I watched his performance, feeling completely numb to their cruelty. They thought banning me from the waiting area would render me powerless, assuming I would sit quietly and accept the blame for a medical emergency. They forgot who they were dealing with. I pulled my secure tablet from my bag and connected to the hospital network. Obsidian Tech had handled their data migration audit last year, so I still had active administrative clearance. Furthermore, in their frantic rush to cut me out of the family legacy, my parents and Julian had forgotten a crucial piece of paperwork. 5 years ago, when Chloe had her appendix removed, my parents forced me to sign on as her primary medical proxy to handle the billing. They never legally revoked that status. I was still officially documented in her file as a designated decision-maker with full access to her medical records. I bypassed the hostel reception desk and walked down the adjacent administrative corridor, swiping my credentials to access the restricted physician's wing. I located Dr. Aris, the chief attending physician. He was reviewing a stack of lab results, looking perplexed. I introduced myself, verifying my identity and legal proxy status on his digital tablet. He verified my credentials, nodding in relief as he handed me the blood panel and ultrasound reports. We spoke privately for 10 minutes. I reviewed the cold medical data, feeling a strange mixture of absolute vindication and profound disgust. The puzzle pieces clicked into place perfectly, exposing a level of deception I had not fully anticipated. Armed with the irrefutable truth, I thanked the doctor and walked back to the waiting room, arriving just as Julian was wiping a fake tear from his eye while comforting my mother. Dr. Aris followed closely behind me, his medical chart clutched tightly against his chest. The moment my family spotted the physician, they rushed forward like a tidal wave. Julian demanded to know if his son was safe, his voice cracking with manufactured grief. Evelyn clutched her pearls, praying loudly for a miracle. Dr. Aris adjusted his glasses, looking directly at Julian with a flat, professional expression that offered zero comfort. He stated that he had completed a full pelvic ultrasound and run a comprehensive toxicology screening. The waiting room held its collective breath. Dr. Aris cleared his throat and delivered the final blow. "There is no baby," he stated, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Your wife is not experiencing a miscarriage because she is not currently pregnant. In fact, her ultrasound indicates she has not been pregnant at any point in the recent past." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian froze, his mouth hanging open. Evelyn stumbled backward, catching herself on a chair. My father stared at the doctor in utter disbelief. Before any of them could attempt to process the lie, Dr. Aris continued reading from his chart. "However, we did discover the actual cause of her sudden abdominal collapse. The blood panel revealed significantly high traces of illegal narcotics in her system. Her body is currently experiencing a severe reaction to a combination of unprescribed amphetamines." The golden child illusion vanished into thin air. Chloe was not a tragic victim protecting her unborn baby from an evil sister. She was an addict hiding behind a phantom pregnancy to escape the consequences of aiding a massive financial fraud. Julian turned completely pale, stepping away from my parents as if he suddenly needed to distance himself from the radioactive truth. I stood quietly watching the foundation of their perfect family crumble into dust on the linoleum floor. I expected silence, or perhaps shame, but I severely underestimated the depth of my mother's terrifying denial. Evelyn whipped around, her eyes wide and wild. She crossed the short distance between us in 2 rapid strides and swung her arm with all her remaining strength. The sharp crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed through the quiet waiting room. My head snapped to the side, my skin burning hot from the impact. I slowly turned my face back to look at her, tasting a faint trace of copper in my mouth. Evelyn was panting, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs that I had somehow bribed the doctor to lie. She accused me of using my tech fortune to falsify the medical records just to ruin her perfect daughter. She reached frantically into her purse, digging past her wallet and keys. She aggressively yanked out a crinkled handwritten piece of paper, waving it triumphantly in my face. "Big Mama always knew you were an evil, vindictive monster," Evelyn shrieked, her voice echoing down the sterile hallway. That is exactly why she left a revised will. The crinkled paper shook violently in my mother's grasp as she shoved it inches from my bleeding cheek. She declared it was a holographic will entirely handwritten by Big Mama just 3 days before she passed away in hospice. According to Evelyn, the document legally revoked the original trust and left the historic property, the land, and every single family heirloom exclusively to Chloe. The audacity of the lie hung heavily in the sterile hospital air. Chloe was still curled on the floor, shaking off the effects of the narcotics, but she managed to look up with a glimmer of greedy hope returning to her bloodshot eyes. My father, who had been momentarily paralyzed by the revelation of his daughter's fake pregnancy and drug use, immediately latched on to this new lifeline. He smoothed his clerical collar and stepped forward, loudly praising the Lord for divine intervention and demanding I surrender the property keys right there in the waiting room. Julian did not miss a single beat. He instantly abandoned his grieving father persona, his finance bro arrogance snapping right back into place. He pulled his phone from his pocket with a triumphant smirk, dialing a number on speakerphone so we could all hear the final nail being driven into my coffin. He called his older brother Brad, a ruthless corporate litigator who specialized in bulldozing inheritance disputes for wealthy clients. Julian paced the waiting room loudly, instructing Brad to bypass the standard probate queue. He bragged about how easily they could expedite the handwritten will through the local courts, promising Brad a lucrative cut of the condo development profits once my grandmother's home was demolished. Brad laughed through the phone speaker, assuring Julian that an unrepresented single woman would not even make it past the first preliminary hearing. They discussed my childhood home like it was already an empty pile of dirt waiting for their cement trucks to arrive and pave over my history. My mother shoved the paper directly into my chest, daring me to read the words that would supposedly leave me with absolutely nothing. I took the document with steady hands. The paper was weathered, artificially aged to look like it had been sitting in a lockbox for years. The handwriting initially looked flawless. It was a beautiful, sweeping cursive that perfectly mimicked the elegant loops and sharp slants of my grandmother. I stared at the dark blue ink and the sterile hospital walls melted away. I was suddenly 10 years old again, sitting at the scarred oak kitchen table with Big Mama. While Chloe was out at the country club with my grandmother had spent hours patiently teaching me the lost art of traditional calligraphy. She would guide my small hand, explaining the precise pressure required to make the ink pool at the bottom of a capital letter. She would spend her weekends showing me how the nib of the pen had to glide at a specific 45-degree angle to achieve the perfect thickness on the downstroke. She taught me how true fountain pens scratched the paper, leaving microscopic indentations that told a story in the fibers. She possessed a unique rhythm to her writing, a distinctive pacing that no machine or imposter could ever truly replicate. She used to tell me that a person's handwriting was their soul poured out onto a page, and that a sharp eye could always spot a liar by the hesitation in their strokes. I ran my thumb over the signature at the bottom of the page. The surface was completely smooth. There were no scratches in the paper, no hesitations, and no variations in ink density. It was not written with a traditional fountain pen, which was the only writing instrument Big Mama ever used for legal or important documents. I held the paper closer to the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor, tilting it to catch the glare. The dark blue ink had a distinct, almost metallic sheen to it. It was a gel-based pigment specifically formulated to dry quickly and prevent smudging. I looked at the date scrawled at the top of the page. It claimed to be written exactly 6 years ago. I lowered the document and looked directly at Julian, who was just ending his boastful phone call with Brad. "You hired an exceptional forger, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his celebratory mood. "The penmanship is an incredibly accurate imitation of her style. You almost had me convinced." Julian crossed his arms over his chest, his smug smile unwavering as he told me to stop embarrassing myself and accept defeat. He claimed the document would hold up to any forensic expert in the entire state. I tapped the blue ink signature with my index finger. "The problem is not the handwriting, Julian. The problem is your lack of basic supply chain intelligence." I stepped closer to him, forcing him to look down at the exact spot I was pointing to. This specific metallic blue ink is a proprietary gel formula created by a boutique Japanese stationery company. I happen to know this because Obsidian Tech recently acquired the logistics firm that handles their North American distribution network. I held his gaze, watching the first flicker of doubt enter his eyes. This specific gel pen, the exact one your forger used to write this fake will, was not patented, manufactured, or sold anywhere in the world until 2 years after my grandmother died. My mother let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. My father took a stumbling step backward, the color completely draining from his face. The brilliant, infallible plan they had hatched with their wealthy son-in-law was unraveling in real time, destroyed by a single drop of blue gel ink. I informed Julian that submitting a knowingly forged document to a federal probate court was a felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. I offered to call the police right now and let them run a basic chemical analysis on the ink to verify my claim and send him straight to federal prison. Julian did not back down. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He lunged forward and violently snatched the crinkled paper right out of my hands. He crumpled the forged will into a tight ball, his knuckles turning white from the force. He stepped so close to me that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His lips curled into a vicious, predatory sneer that dropped all pretense of civility. "Who cares about the ink?" Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, meant only for me. "The probate judge is my father's regular golfing buddy. We have dinner at their estate every other weekend. In this town, the word of a wealthy, connected white family beats the claims of a single black woman every single time." He smiled a cold, dead smile that promised absolute ruin. He told me that my tech fortune meant absolutely nothing in the face of generational privilege and systemic corruption. "You are going to lose everything." I turned my back on him and walked out of the sterile hospital corridor without uttering another syllable. Let Julian bask in his fragile manufactured victory for a few more hours. By Tuesday morning, he made good on his venomous threat. I was sitting at my sleek glass desk on the top floor of Obsidian Tech, logging into my private wealth portal to authorize a transfer for my grandmother's estate taxes. A glaring red security banner blocked my screen, informing me that access was completely denied. A courier arrived 20 minutes later, holding a thick, aggressively taped legal envelope. Julian and his brother Brad had cashed in a major favor with Judge Harrison. They secured an emergency temporary injunction under the guise of an ongoing, highly sensitive probate dispute. The order effectively locked down every single dollar of my personal liquid assets. It was a textbook abuse of the local judicial system, a calculated move designed to starve my legal defense fund and force me into submission before a hearing was ever scheduled. As I calmly read through the weaponized court order, my secure office phone vibrated with a flood of urgent notifications. My director of communications rushed into my office looking uncharacteristically panicked. She quickly cast a video to the smart monitor on my wall. Chloe had just posted a 7-minute video to her social media accounts. She sat on her plush velvet sofa, wearing no makeup, and a strategically oversized gray sweater, weeping directly into the camera lens. She spun a masterfully fabricated tale of woe for her 100,000 followers, claiming her cruel, estranged corporate sister had hijacked their beloved grandmother's deathbed and was actively trying to leave her young family destitute. She never mentioned her fake pregnancy. She omitted the forged will. She conveniently forgot to bring up her husband's massive financial fraud. She simply played the tragic, heartbroken victim, crying about how my relentless corporate greed was tearing their fragile family apart. The video spread like wildfire. Thousands of comments poured in within the hour, a digital mob of strangers condemning me, tagging my company, and demanding I be held accountable for elder abuse. My public relations team surrounded my desk, presenting a dozen draft statements to counter the narrative. They begged me to release the hospital toxicology report or the forgery evidence to clear my name in the court of public opinion. I looked at their panicked faces and instructed them to do absolutely nothing. I refused to engage in a petty social media war or a rigged local court battle. Julian desperately wanted me to fight him in his own backyard, a place where his father played golf with the local magistrates, and his brother bought expensive scotch for the district attorneys. He wanted a messy, emotional brawl in the shallow end of the pool, where his systemic privilege guaranteed a victory regardless of the facts. I decided to drown him in the ocean instead. Julian had severely underestimated the actual scope and capability of my business. Obsidian Tech did not just build basic corporate firewalls or fix network routers. Our most lucrative, highly classified contracts were with the United States government. We specialized in designing advanced forensic auditing software for the Internal Revenue Service, specifically aiding the Criminal Investigation Division in tracking corporate tax evasion and international money laundering. I picked up my desk phone, completely bypassing the corrupt local authorities. I dialed a direct encrypted line to a senior federal director I had personally worked with on a massive multinational audit the previous year. I did not need to invent evidence or rely on the biased goodwill of a local judge. I simply handed over the digital map to the offshore shell companies Julian had used to funnel the stolen church pension funds. I legally flagged the accounts under federal anti-money laundering statutes, providing a pristine, immutable digital trail of wire transfers that deliberately circumvented domestic tax laws. The Internal Revenue Service does not care who your father plays golf with in Atlanta. They do not care about viral crying videos on social media, and they certainly do not care about local probate injunctions. When federal investigators see a multi-million-dollar offshore tax evasion scheme tied directly to corporate embezzlement, they move with absolute devastating precision. Within 48 hours, Julian was no longer dealing with a civil family dispute over a historic house. He was the prime target of a federal criminal investigation. The federal freeze order hit his accounts on a Thursday afternoon, locking down his entire financial existence and seizing the assets of his development firm. I was reviewing my quarterly revenue reports when my private cell phone began to ring incessantly. It was my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the sheer frantic desperation vibrating through the ringtone made me press accept. Evelyn was hyperventilating, her words tumbling out in a hysterical, disjointed rush. She was screaming that a team of men in dark suits had just shown up at their front door with a massive stack of legal documents. My father had collapsed into his leather armchair, clutching his chest and staring blankly at the wall. I asked her in a flat, emotionless tone what the men wanted. My mother sobbed uncontrollably, finally confessing a massive secret that perfectly explained their blind, desperate loyalty to their son-in-law. 5 months ago, Julian had convinced my father to secretly put up their sprawling family home as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan to save his failing real estate development. The men standing on their front porch were not federal agents, they were bank representatives. Julian had completely defaulted on the hidden loan, and the bank was initiating an immediate foreclosure to seize the only home my parents had ever owned. I ended the call and walked out of my glass corner office without a second backward glance. I instructed my private driver to take me directly to the Springfield estate, watching the city's skyline blur past the tinted windows of my car. I arrived at the exact moment the bank representatives were walking down the pristine cobblestone driveway, their briefcases firmly in hand. The front door of my childhood home was wide open, exposing the grand foyer and the glittering crystal chandelier my mother valued above human connection. I stepped across the threshold into an atmosphere thick with absolute panic. Evelyn was pacing frantically across the imported Persian rug, her mascara smudged and her breathing shallow. Thomas was standing by the grand staircase, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. The moment my mother saw me, she rushed forward and attempted to grab my forearms with a desperate clawing grip. She demanded I fix this immediate crisis, claiming I had more than enough liquid capital sitting in my corporate accounts to make the bank representatives go away. Thomas stepped forward, his posture rigid and his chest puffed out as he miraculously recovered from his catatonic shock. He completely ignored the reality that his golden son-in-law had just gambled away his family home on a fraudulent development scheme. Instead, He turned his righteous indignation entirely onto me. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, his voice booming with the hypocritical authority he usually reserved for Sunday sermons. He demanded I immediately wire the required funds to clear the bridge loan debt. "We are your parents," he bellowed, his face twisting with entitlement. "The Bible says honor thy mother and father. You owe us this money, Maya." I smoothly sidestepped my mother's grasping hands and stared directly into my father's furious eyes. The sheer audacity of his demand did not surprise me, but the ease with which he attempted to weaponize religion against me was almost laughable. I kept my voice dangerously calm, refusing to match his frantic shouting energy. I asked him exactly what kind of honor he thought he was entitled to collect. I leaned forward, forcing him to hold my gaze. "Where was that honor when you made me sleep in the unfinished basement so Chloe's purebred dogs could have the guest room?" I asked, watching the color drain slightly from his flushed cheeks. I reminded them both of that bitterly cold winter when I was 17 years old. They had forced me to pack all of my belongings into garbage bags and move my bed onto a cracked concrete floor next to a leaking water heater. Chloe had just purchased 2 expensive Afghan hounds, and Evelyn had declared that the animals required the temperature-controlled, plushly carpeted guest room for their sensitive joints. I spent 6 months shivering under a thin blanket, listening to my sister treat animals better than my parents treated their own flesh and blood. I informed Thomas that respect was a currency he had bankrupted decades ago, and I absolutely refused to pay the bank a single cent to save his house. Evelyn let out a dramatic wail and collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, burying her face in her hands. She cried that they would be homeless, that their country club friends would laugh at them, and that their social standing in the community was permanently destroyed. But Julian, who had been sitting quietly in the adjacent formal living room, suddenly let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He pushed himself off the velvet sofa and adjusted his expensive silk tie, his signature arrogance returning in full force. He walked over to my parents, placing a comforting hand on Thomas's shoulder and shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian confidently told my parents to stop begging a bitter, vindictive spinster for spare change. He promised them they had absolutely nothing to worry about, because he had already handled the situation. He claimed his real estate development firm had recently secured a massive private investor, a silent partner with deep pockets who specialized in aggressive, distressed property acquisitions. Julian puffed out his chest, bragging to my father that this mysterious, wealthy benefactor was already stepping in to purchase the bridge loan debt directly from the bank. He assured Evelyn that the investor would restructure the financing, saving the property from foreclosure and allowing the family to keep their pristine suburban castle without skipping a beat. He turned his attention back to me, crossing his arms and sneering. He boasted that real high-stakes business deals were handled by connected men in boardrooms, not by angry little girls holding on to pathetic childhood grudges. I did not offer him a response. I simply checked the gold watch on my wrist and waited in the heavy silence. Right on cue, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed loudly through the foyer. Julian smirked triumphantly, announcing to my weeping mother that his financial savior had finally arrived to clean up the mess. He strode confidently across the hardwood floor and pulled the heavy oak door open, a welcoming, charismatic smile plastered across his face. A tall woman in an immaculate razor-sharp charcoal suit stepped across the threshold. She was not carrying a briefcase full of bailout cash or a friendly restructuring agreement. She was holding a stark white legal clipboard. Julian froze completely, his smug, triumphant expression instantly vaporizing as his brain struggled to process her identity. It was Victoria Vance, the notoriously ruthless lead corporate attorney for Obsidian Tech. Victoria did not offer a greeting. She simply handed the heavy clipboard directly to Julian. It was a formal, expedited eviction notice. Julian stared at the paperwork, his hands shaking violently, as he tried to stammer out a confused question about his private investor. I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with my lead attorney. I looked Julian dead in the eyes and thanked him for presenting me with such an excellent, highly profitable business opportunity. I informed him that his mysterious, wealthy private investor was actually a blind trust completely controlled by my cybersecurity firm. I was the private investor. I had legally bought his fraudulent defaulted debt for absolute pennies on the dollar, and I was now the sole owner of the estate. Julian stood frozen on the porch of the estate he no longer owned, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Victoria Vance stepped past him, methodically explaining that he and my parents had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before law enforcement physically removed them. I did not stay to watch my mother weep or my father attempt to negotiate with a woman who billed $1,000 an hour. I simply turned on my heel, climbed back into the leather seats of my waiting car, and instructed my driver to take me back to the city. Julian was officially homeless, stripped of his assets, and publicly humiliated. But a wounded animal is always the most dangerous, and Julian was not entirely out of desperate schemes. 3 days later, the high-altitude air inside the Vanguard Capital boardroom was thin and freezing. I was seated at the polished mahogany table attending a mandatory emergency shareholder meeting. As the primary stakeholder who had recently absorbed Julian's hollowed-out development firm, my presence was required to officially finalize the corporate restructuring. The board members, a collection of stoic, silver-haired billionaires, were halfway through the morning agenda when the heavy double doors at the back of the room violently burst open. Julian marched into the executive suite flanked by 3 aggressive, highly paid defense attorneys. He looked terrible. His usually flawless designer suit was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot and a frantic, manic energy radiated from his rigid posture. He ignored the shocked protests of the board chairman and slammed his hands down on the polished wood table directly across from me. He loudly declared that the entire corporate acquisition was a complete fraud. His lead attorney immediately began pacing the room aggressively, firing off legal jargon designed to intimidate the room. The lawyer claimed I had engaged in tortious interference utilizing illegal corporate espionage to artificially crash Julian's portfolio. They argued that Julian had signed over his firm under extreme emotional distress and coercion, rendering the entire acquisition completely unconscionable and legally invalid. Julian leaned across the table, his lip curling into a vicious sneer. He looked at the assembled billionaires and attempted to dismantle my professional credibility. He told the board that I was nothing but an uneducated amateur, a glorified keyboard jockey who lacked a formal business education. He mocked my background, claiming I had no MBA, no understanding of institutional finance, and absolutely no right to sit at a table with established industry titans. He painted a picture of a vindictive, unstable woman who was using stolen tech money to execute a petty family vendetta, begging the board to invalidate the hostile takeover and restore him as the rightful CEO. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The board chairman looked at me, his eyebrows raised in a silent demand for an explanation. Julian crossed his arms, breathing heavily, wearing a triumphant smirk, as if his high-priced legal theater had actually cornered me. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with his attorneys, and I certainly did not defend my educational background. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of 12 glossy black dossiers. I slid them across the length of the long mahogany table, ensuring every single board member and Julian received a copy. I calmly instructed the board to open the files. The sound of thick paper flipping filled the silent room. I watched as the color rapidly drained from the chairman's face. I explained that Vanguard Capital had quietly hired my cybersecurity firm Obsidian Tech 7 months ago to investigate a highly classified, devastating internal data leak. Someone inside their organization had been systematically bypassing their encrypted firewalls. I directed their attention to the 3rd page of the dossier. It contained immutable, time-stamped server logs, cryptographic signatures, and direct routing numbers. I looked directly at Julian, whose triumphant smirk had instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Julian was the mole. He had been quietly siphoning Vanguard Capital's most sensitive client data, high net worth portfolios, social security numbers, and offshore routing codes, and selling them to malicious actors on the dark web. He was using the massive cryptocurrency payouts to fund his lavish lifestyle and cover the massive losses from his failing real estate developments. He had not just defrauded my family, he had committed massive corporate treason. The boardroom erupted. The chairman slammed his fist down on the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He did not ask Julian's lawyers for a rebuttal. He immediately looked at the head of corporate security standing by the door and demanded Julian be detained. The board unanimously and instantly voted not only to terminate Julian with extreme prejudice, but to hand the entire dossier directly over to federal prosecutors. They agreed to press maximum federal charges for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Julian's high-priced lawyers, realizing their client had just lied to them and dragged them into a federal crime scene, quietly packed their briefcases and abandoned him on the spot. Julian was completely backed into a corner. His firm was gone, his home was gone, his family was ruined, and he was staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison. The security guard stepped forward to grab his arms, but Julian violently wrenched himself free. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver encrypted flash drive. He held it up in the air, his hand shaking violently, a deranged, desperate light burning in his bloodshot eyes. He looked exclusively at me, ignoring the shouting board members and the approaching guards. He threatened me with his final desperate weapon. He claimed he had spent the last 2 months paying a rogue developer to silently infiltrate my company network. He gripped the silver medal tightly and smiled a broken, terrifying smile. He announced that he held the master source code to Obsidian Tech's flagship security software, and he promised to sell it to my biggest international rival before the federal agents could even put him in handcuffs. Julian shoved past the stunned security guards and bolted from the Vanguard Capital Executive Suite, sprinting down the marble corridor before anyone could physically restrain him. He knew he only had a handful of hours before federal warrants were fully processed and his passport was flagged at every international terminal. He rendezvoused with Chloe, who was waiting in a rented black town car with 2 hastily packed suitcases. They sped directly to the towering glass headquarters of Apex Dynamics, Obsidian Tech's largest and most aggressive international competitor. The CEO of Apex, a ruthless tech billionaire named Marcus Sterling, had been trying to reverse engineer my proprietary security architecture for the past 4 years. Julian walked into Marcus's top-floor office like a man holding a winning lottery ticket, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking into a trap of his own making. Julian slammed the silver flash drive onto Marcus's desk. He demanded $20 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, offering full unrestricted access to Obsidian Tech's foundational source code. Chloe sat beside him nervously, clutching her designer handbag, whispering to Julian about their chartered flight to a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. Marcus, blinded by his own corporate greed and desperate to crush my company, did not ask the necessary questions. He immediately produced a preliminary term sheet outlining the massive crypto transfer contingent on a brief verification of the drive's contents. My phone buzzed as I sat in the back of my town car, heading back to my office. A text message from Chloe illuminated the screen. It was a high-resolution photograph of the signed $20 million term sheet, complete with Marcus Sterling's unmistakable signature. Beneath the image, Chloe had typed a single gloating message. "Enjoy being bankrupt, loser." I stared at the glowing screen and let out a genuine relaxed laugh. I did not call my security team, and I did not contact the authorities to intercept the transaction. I simply opened my secure tablet and pulled up a live tracking dashboard. Julian had spent 2 months paying a rogue developer to silently infiltrate my company network, but my internal auditing software had flagged the unauthorized access attempt within 30 seconds of the initial breach. Instead of locking the rogue developer out, I had quietly built a digital sandbox. I created a spectacularly complex honeypot, a fabricated, completely useless set of files disguised to look exactly like our master source code. The moment Julian downloaded the files onto his encrypted flash drive, he had unknowingly armed a highly aggressive autonomous digital tripwire. Inside the Apex Dynamics boardroom, Marcus Sterling inserted the silver flash drive into his secure terminal to verify his $20 million purchase. He opened the primary directory and double-clicked the executable file labeled Master Architecture. The honeypot detonated instantly. Marcus's monitor flashed violently before turning pitch black. A scrolling wall of crimson hexadecimal code cascaded down the screen. The malicious script did not just wipe the flash drive. It aggressively leaped from the terminal, rapidly infecting the entire Apex Dynamics internal network. It engaged a military-grade ransomware protocol that I had personally designed for cyber warfare simulations. Within 60 seconds, every single server database and employee workstation inside the Apex building was completely bricked. Alarms began blaring through the corporate headquarters. Furthermore, the honeypot simultaneously transmitted a localized distress beacon directly to the FBI Cybercrimes Division, instantly flagging Apex Dynamics as the epicenter of a massive active cyber attack involving stolen federal contracting data. Marcus Sterling stared at his dead monitor, the color draining from his face, as his office phone lit up with panicked calls from his IT department. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Julian had not brought him a $20 million competitive advantage. Julian had just handed him a digital bomb that obliterated his entire corporate infrastructure and directly implicated him in the receipt of stolen federal property. Marcus stood up slowly, his eyes burning with a murderous rage. He looked at Julian and Chloe, who were still sitting on the leather sofa waiting for their crypto transfer. Marcus did not yell. He simply walked out of the glass-enclosed conference room and pulled the heavy door shut behind him. An electronic magnetic lock snapped into place with a sharp click. Julian jumped up, grabbing the door handle, realizing instantly that they were trapped inside. Marcus stood on the other side of the soundproof glass, his face twisted in fury, holding his cell phone to his ear. Julian could read his lips perfectly as Marcus told the federal dispatchers exactly who was in his office. Panic consumed Julian. He looked at Chloe, who was screaming and pounding her fists uselessly against the reinforced glass. The distant wail of police sirens was already echoing through the downtown streets. Julian grabbed a heavy bronze sculpture from a display pedestal in the corner of the room. He swung it with all of his remaining strength, smashing the glass wall into a spiderweb of cracks before kicking it completely outward. The glass shattered, raining down on the carpet. Julian grabbed Chloe by the arm and dragged her through the broken opening, sprinting down the executive stairwell to avoid the lockdown protocols. They burst into the underground parking garage just as the first black SUV screeched up to the front of the building. Julian shoved a terrified executive out of a running sports car, threw Chloe into the passenger seat, and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The screech of burning rubber echoed through the concrete parking structure as the stolen sports car violently fishtailed up the exit ramp, tearing through the wooden toll arm and disappearing into the chaotic downtown traffic. Within minutes, the wail of police sirens intensified as federal agents swarmed the Apex Dynamics building, officially triggering a nationwide manhunt for Julian and Chloe. The news of the corporate sabotage and the subsequent grand theft auto broke on local television networks before the evening news cycle even officially began. It was a spectacular, highly public implosion that left absolute ruin in its wake. Yet while her favorite daughter and golden son-in-law were actively fleeing federal authorities in a hijacked vehicle, Evelyn chose a psychological defense mechanism bordering on complete clinical delusion. She simply refused to acknowledge reality. The annual Oak Ridge Country Club Spring Gala was the crown jewel of the local high society calendar, a heavily catered, ostentatious event where the elite gathered to flaunt their generational wealth and scrutinize their neighbors. A normal person facing the complete financial ruin of their family and the imminent federal indictment of their child would have drawn the curtains and hidden from the world. Evelyn instead spent 4 hours at an exclusive salon, getting a blowout and a professional makeup application. She draped herself in a shimmering emerald silk gown, fastened a heavy diamond necklace around her throat, and hired a private town car to drop her off at the valet stand. She was absolutely determined to maintain the brittle facade of her perfect, untouchable suburban life. Evelyn glided into the grand ballroom as if she were royalty inspecting her subjects. She immediately gravitated toward the VIP lounge area, surrounding herself with a tight circle of wealthy, impeccably dressed women who thrived on country club gossip. As the waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne flutes, Evelyn expertly controlled the narrative. I watched from the upper mezzanine balcony as she held court, expertly dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She leaned in close to the wives of prominent judges and local politicians, whispering vicious, fabricated tales about my mental state. She claimed I had suffered a catastrophic psychological breakdown. She spun a story where Julian's legal troubles were nothing more than a minor administrative misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion by my manic, jealous delusions. She painted me as a bitter, unstable woman who was using my tech fortune to harass her beautiful, successful sister out of sheer spite. The women gasped in orchestrated sympathy, patting Evelyn's arm and praising her remarkable strength for enduring such a tragic burden. I adjusted the neckline of my backless, floor-length crimson gown and walked slowly down the sweeping marble staircase toward the main ballroom floor. I did not sneak in through the side entrance or attempt to blend into the crowd. I walked with the deliberate, heavy steps of an executioner. The soft hum of the string quartet seemed to fade as heads began to turn. Conversations abruptly halted. The crowd naturally parted, creating a clear, unimpeded path directly toward the velvet ropes of the VIP lounge. Evelyn spotted me from across the room, and the color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her fake, tragic smile contorted into a mask of genuine panic. She quickly set her champagne flute down on a passing tray and marched directly toward the velvet ropes, gesturing frantically for her high society friends to form a physical blockade. Three women in expensive designer dresses stepped shoulder to shoulder with my mother, lifting their chins and glaring at me with practiced disdain. Evelyn crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her voice a sharp, venomous hiss designed to carry just far enough for the surrounding guests to hear. She ordered me to turn around and walk out the front door immediately. She loudly declared that the gala was an exclusive members-only event and that my unstable, erratic presence was disturbing the respectable guests. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers in the air, aggressively signaling for the head of club security to come and physically remove her deranged daughter from the premises. The club general manager, a rigid, highly status-conscious man named Arthur, who had spent the last 2 decades treating my mother like a queen, hurriedly pushed his way through the gathered crowd. Evelyn smiled triumphantly, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest and demanding he call the local police to escort me off the property. Arthur did not reach for his radio. He did not look at my mother. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo, and bowed his head in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect. He warmly welcomed me to the gala loud enough for the entire silent ballroom to hear, and asked if the catering and lighting arrangements were to my exact specifications. Evelyn stumbled backward, her designer heel catching on the edge of the velvet rope. She looked at Arthur in sheer, uncomprehending horror, demanding to know why he was bowing to a crazy person instead of throwing me out into the street. I stepped past the useless velvet rope, invading the sacred VIP space she valued above her own children. "I didn't come to crash your party, Evelyn," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "I came to inspect my property. I bought this country club yesterday." The collective gasp from her wealthy friends was like music to my ears. Evelyn's mouth opened, but her vocal cords completely failed her. The illusion of her untouchable social supremacy shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the imported ballroom rug. I reached over to the nearby podium, picked up the wireless microphone that was set up for the evening's charity auction, and powered it on. The sharp feedback echoed through the massive room, ensuring every single pair of eyes was locked directly onto us. I held the sleek black microphone out, pressing the cold metal directly into my mother's trembling hand. I stared into her terrified wide eyes. "Tell them, Mother. I commanded, my voice projecting through the towering speakers. Tell the community where the church pension fund really went, or I will project the bank statements on the ballroom wall. Evelyn's knuckles turned bone white as she gripped the microphone, but her lips remained firmly pressed together in a stubborn, terrified seal. She looked out at the sea of expectant faces, the very people she had spent her entire adult life trying to impress, and found absolutely no sympathy. The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening, broken only by the clinking of ice in abandoned glasses and the nervous shifting of expensive leather shoes. She opened her mouth, closed it, and cast a desperate, pleading look over her shoulder. Reverend Thomas Vance. My esteemed stepfather and the moral pillar of the Oak Ridge community shoved his way past the dessert buffet and stormed toward us. His normally ruddy, jovial face was slick with sweat, and the veins in his thick neck bulged against his stiff white clerical collar. He practically ripped the microphone from Evelyn's trembling fingers, stepping between us, as if physically shielding his wife from the consequences of her own actions. Thomas forced a wide, benevolent smile, projecting his booming, practiced pulpit voice into the room. He addressed the gathered crowd of country club elite and wealthy congregation members, attempting to instantly spin the narrative into a tale of spiritual warfare. He declared that this was a test of faith, a malicious attack by the devil himself, designed to tear a righteous family apart. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me, telling his flock that I was a lost, troubled soul, suffering from a severe crisis of faith. He begged the community for their prayers and their forgiveness, insisting that the church funds were perfectly safe, merely reallocated into a high-yield, long-term growth portfolio managed by a trusted family associate. Thomas was masterful at playing the victim, wrapping his financial negligence in a thick layer of religious martyrdom. He urged the band to resume playing, suggesting everyone return to their champagne and let the family handle this private spiritual matter. I did not argue with his sermon, nor did I attempt to wrestle the microphone back from his sweaty grip. I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. As the new owner of the Oak Ridge Country Club, I had spent the morning syncing my device to the building's central command system. I bypassed the stage mixer entirely, routing my phone's audio directly into the massive, high-fidelity surround sound speakers mounted in all four corners of the ballroom. I tapped a single audio file on my screen. The crystal-clear sound of my sister Chloe's high-pitched, mocking laughter suddenly blasted through the room, completely drowning out Thomas's frantic preaching. Julian's voice echoed next, dripping with arrogant amusement. He was bragging about the ink drying on the transfer documents. I watched Thomas freeze the microphone, dropping slowly to his side, as Julian's recorded voice gloated about how remarkably easy it had been to secure the capital. Julian called Thomas a stupid, gullible old man who cared more about appearing wealthy to his snobby congregation than actually auditing a basic financial contract. Chloe chimed in on the recording, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. She mocked the church elders by name, calling them pious, bleeding heart idiots who were practically begging to be robbed blind to fund her new designer wardrobe and their upcoming permanent vacation. The recording continued relentlessly. Julian detailed exactly how he had funneled the entire retirement fund through 3 offshore shell companies within 24 hours of Thomas signing the authorization. He laughed about the fact that the elderly congregation members would be eating cat food by next winter, while he and Chloe were sipping margaritas on a private beach. I stopped the audio playback and slid the phone back into my purse. The air in the ballroom felt as if it had been sucked entirely out of the room. The wealthy elite of Oak Ridge, the judges, the politicians, and the devout church elders stood in absolute paralyzed shock. The collective realization hit the crowd like a tidal wave. The respectful murmurs instantly morphed into a cacophony of outrage and disgust. A prominent city councilman who had just donated heavily to Thomas's recent building fund threw his champagne glass onto the marble floor, the shattering sound acting as a starting gun. The congregation turned on Thomas and Evelyn with terrifying speed. Women who had been air-kissing my mother's cheeks 10 minutes ago were now screaming obscenities at her. Men in tailored tuxedos surged forward, demanding answers, their faces flushed with righteous fury. The social status that Evelyn had sacrificed my entire childhood to build the pristine reputation she valued above her own flesh and blood completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. They were no longer the king and queen of Oak Ridge society. They were pariahs exposed as complicit fools who had allowed a pair of greedy con artists to steal the life savings of their most devout friends. Thomas stumbled backward, dropping the microphone, holding his hands up in a futile attempt to pacify the angry mob advancing on him. Evelyn covered her face, openly sobbing, now shrinking away from the venomous glares of the women she used to rule. Before the angry crowd could physically reach the VIP ropes, the heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom violently burst open. Chloe staggered into the venue looking absolutely unrecognizable. Her custom silk dress was torn at the hem and stained with motor oil. Her expensive hair extensions were a tangled, matted mess, and black mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide and manic, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the furious gala attendees. She lunged into the center of the room, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek that cut right through the shouting crowd. She pointed wildly at the doors, screaming that Julian had lied to her. She sobbed uncontrollably, announcing to the entire ruined family that her perfect husband had drained every single stolen cent from their shared accounts, dumped her out of a stolen car at a rural gas station, and abandoned her to face the FBI completely alone. Chloe remained a crumpled, hysterical mess on the imported rug, the reality of her situation completely crashing down upon her. She completely ignored Evelyn, who was still frozen in absolute shock, and scrambled directly toward me on her hands and knees. Her torn silk dress dragged heavily across the polished floor as she closed the distance. She collapsed right at my feet, her hands desperately grasping at the fabric of my crimson gown. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as she begged me to use my wealth and corporate connections to save her from federal prison. She cried that she was completely terrified of jail, claiming she was nothing more than an innocent victim of Julian's ruthless manipulation. She looked up at me with dark, smeared makeup running down her face and pleaded that we were sisters, insisting desperately that blood is thicker than water. I looked down at the pathetic woman groveling on the floor in front of the entire high society congregation. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or familial obligation. I calmly reached down and peeled her frantic fingers off my expensive dress, stepping back to create a physical boundary between us. I asked her if blood was thicker than water on the night she intentionally stuffed her diamond tennis bracelet into my high school backpack and called the local police. I reminded her how she had watched the officers aggressively handcuff me and drag me into a juvenile holding cell simply so she could ensure I was locked away while she snuck out to a fraternity formal. I stared directly into her panicked, bloodshot eyes and told her that water is thicker than whatever runs in her veins. Chloe let out a sharp, strangled gasp, the sudden realization hitting her that her lifelong tactics of emotional manipulation were now entirely useless. She began to hyperventilate harder, changing her tactic from demanding salvation to begging for scraps. She pleaded for just a fraction of my immense wealth, just enough cash to hire a competent criminal defense attorney so she would not spend the next decade rotting behind federal bars. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a small plain white business card. I let it slip from my fingers, watching it flutter down, to land directly on the carpet in front of her knees. I informed her it was the direct phone line to the county public defender's office. I stated with absolute icy clarity, loud enough for the entire silent ballroom to hear, that I would not spend a single penny of my hard-earned fortune to defend a fraudster who had gleefully participated in my attempted destruction. Evelyn finally let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing against a cocktail table as her perfect world officially disintegrated. The country club elite turned their backs in unison, muttering in disgust, and rapidly moving toward the exits to immediately distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. Before Chloe could launch into another hysterical fit of pleading, a sharp, piercing ringtone cut through the heavy tension in the room. I pulled my phone from my purse and saw an encrypted, unidentified number flashing brightly on the screen. I accepted the call and pressed the device to my ear. Julian's voice immediately blasted through the speaker, breathless, frantic, and barely audible against the deafening roar of jet engines in the background. He was standing on the tarmac of an unregulated private airstrip just outside the county limit. He told me he was exactly 5 minutes away from boarding a chartered untraceable flight to a non-extradition zone. He had not called to gloat or apologize over his spectacular failure at Apex Dynamics. He had called to execute one final desperate extortion attempt. Julian revealed that during his systematic illegal looting of the family assets, he had stolen the original physical digitized deed to Big Mama's house. He knew it was the only piece of property I truly cared about, the only tangible connection I had left to my cherished safe childhood memories. He gripped his phone tightly and screamed his final ultimatum over the roar of the turbines, demanding a direct, untraceable wire transfer of $5 million in the next 10 minutes. If the money did not hit his account, he promised to throw the irreplaceable, fragile document directly into the spinning jet engine before vanishing forever. I turned my back on Chloe as she collapsed into a sobbing heap on the ballroom floor, leaving her to the mercy of the furious congregation she had just mocked. I had no time to waste on a discarded pawn. Julian had given me a 10-minute deadline, and the private county airstrip was exactly an 8-minute drive if I pushed my car to its absolute limits. I sprinted out of the country club, ignoring the frantic shouts of my mother and Thomas, who were now surrounded by a mob of ruined investors demanding their life savings back. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my sports car, slammed the gear shift into drive, and tore out of the valet circle, leaving the wreckage of Evelyn's social empire in my rearview mirror. The access road to the private airfield was unlit and treacherous, but I kept my foot pinned to the floorboard. The smell of aviation fuel and salty night air flooded my senses as I breached the perimeter gate. I slammed on the brakes, sending a shower of gravel across the tarmac just 50 feet from a sleek, idling Gulfstream jet. Julian stood near the boarding stairs, illuminated by the harsh glare of my high beams. He looked absolutely deranged. His bespoke suit was torn at the shoulder, his tie was missing, and his hair stood up in chaotic tufts. In his left hand, he tightly gripped the yellowed, fragile parchment of Big Mama's original property deed. In his right hand, he held a heavy silver lighter, his thumb resting dangerously on the striker wheel. Julian squinted against my headlights, a manic, desperate grin splitting his sweaty face. He stepped away from the roaring jet turbine and shouted over the mechanical whine, demanding to know if the $5 million wire transfer had cleared. I stepped out of my car, the cool wind whipping my crimson gown around my ankles, and began walking slowly toward him. I held my empty hands out to my sides, showing him I had no weapon and no phone. Julian panicked, flicking the lighter. A bright orange flame erupted, casting dancing shadows across his hollow, exhausted face. He brought the flame within an inch of the brittle century-old paper. He taunted me, his voice cracking with hysteria. He reminded me of the blood, sweat, and endless suffering our ancestors had endured to secure this single piece of land. He mocked my modern empire, laughing at the fact that all my algorithms, cybersecurity firms, and billions in offshore accounts were completely useless against a dollar store lighter. He screamed that he would erase our family history from the face of the earth if his offshore crypto wallet did not update in the next 30 seconds. He thought he finally had me cornered, using the one thing he believed I valued more than my own life. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still on the oil-stained asphalt and looked at the pathetic, broken man clutching a piece of paper. I slowly raised my left wrist and deliberately checked the time on my diamond watch. I looked back up at Julian and smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile. "Burn it," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the screaming jet engine. "It is a piece of paper." Peace. Julian's manic grin instantly vanished, replaced by total confusion. His hand trembled, pulling the flame slightly away from the deed. He demanded to know what I was talking about, insisting that this was the original document, the only legal proof of ownership in existence. I took another step forward, enjoying the absolute terror radiating from his posture. I told him he was holding a useless antique. I explained that I had spent the last 3 months working quietly with a team of elite property attorneys. We had successfully transferred the entirety of Big Mama's estate into a digitally encrypted, irrevocable trust. I informed him that the digital transfer was already ratified by the Supreme Court yesterday morning. That piece of parchment in his hand held zero legal authority. It was nothing more than old ink and dead wood. I told him to go ahead and burn it because Big Mama's legacy was no longer bound to a fragile piece of paper that a coward could hold hostage. Julian's mouth fell open. He looked at the deed, then at the lighter, the realization of his ultimate failure crushing his spirit. His hand shook violently, and he dropped the silver lighter onto the tarmac. He spun around, abandoning the extortion attempt entirely, and lunged for the boarding stairs of the Gulf Stream. He screamed at the pilot to initiate takeoff immediately, desperate to escape before the local police arrived. I crossed my arms and shook my head. "Oh, and by the way, Julian," I called out to him. "You cannot board that plane." Julian froze halfway up the metal stairs. The cockpit door swung open and the pilot stepped out onto the top platform. He was not wearing a standard commercial aviation uniform. He was dressed in a dark tactical vest, and his hand rested firmly on the sidearm strapped to his thigh. He reached into his chest pocket, pulling out a leather wallet, and flipped it open to reveal a shining silver badge. The undercover federal agent looked down at Julian with absolute disgust and told him to put his hands on his head. Before Julian could even process the trap, the deafening roar of police sirens erupted from the darkness as 6 black tactical vehicles swarmed the airstrip, pinning the aircraft in a cage of flashing red and blue lights. The flashing lights of the tactical cruisers illuminated Julian's face as federal agents slammed him against the fuselage of the Gulfstream. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The undercover pilot secured the antique deed in an evidence bag, nodding respectfully to me as local police swarmed the tarmac to take Julian into federal custody. He did not look back at me as they shoved his head down and forced him into the back of a police vehicle. He was completely broken, finally realizing that his superficial charm, his stolen wealth, and his arrogant sense of superiority were utterly powerless against cold, hard reality. 2 weeks passed, bringing a relentless cascade of absolute ruin for my former family. Julian was denied bail, labeled an extreme flight risk by the federal judge, and transferred to a maximum security holding facility. Chloe was formally indicted as a key co-conspirator in the wire fraud and corporate espionage charges. Without a single dime of my money to shield her, she was forced to rely on the overworked public defender I had suggested, spending her days weeping in a Stark County jail cell while desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal the prosecutors had zero interest in offering. The fallout for my mother and Thomas was equally devastating. The church board held an emergency session the very next morning, instantly ousting Thomas from his pulpit. They seized the luxurious parsonage, froze his remaining personal accounts, and publicly distanced themselves from his leadership to cooperate with the federal audit. Evelyn's Sacred Country Club membership was aggressively revoked by the board of directors, citing moral turpitude and public embarrassment. They were entirely stripped of their home, their congregation, and their untouchable social status. They were left with absolutely nothing. I sat behind the massive mahogany desk in my newly renovated corporate headquarters. Apex Dynamics was now fully integrated into my holding company, the executive offices completely stripped of Julian's ostentatious decor and replaced with sleek, modern minimalism. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the downtown skyline, a physical representation of the empire I had built entirely on my own. My intercom buzzed. My executive assistant informed me that Thomas and Evelyn had arrived in the lobby, begging for a moment of my time. I did not rush to accommodate them. I let them sit in the sterile waiting area for exactly 45 minutes, allowing the reality of our reversed roles to fully settle in their minds before I finally permitted them to enter my office. They walked through the double-glass doors, looking utterly unrecognizable. The arrogant swagger Thomas usually carried into a room was completely gone. He wore a cheap, wrinkled suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Evelyn looked aged by a decade. She wore dark sunglasses indoors, an obvious attempt to hide her swollen, unbotoxed face, and the complete absence of her usual flawless makeup. Her designer handbag had been replaced by a plain canvas tote. They stood awkwardly in front of my desk, waiting for an invitation to sit. I did not offer one. I kept my eyes locked on a quarterly financial report, letting the heavy silence stretch until the discomfort became physically unbearable for them. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice trembling as he launched into a desperate, practiced plea for mercy. He invoked God, he invoked forgiveness, and he invoked the sacred bond of family. He claimed they were destitute, sleeping on the uncomfortable couch of a distant, reluctant cousin who wanted them gone by the end of the week. Evelyn began to cry, reaching a shaking hand across my desk, begging me to remember the good times, insisting that a mother and daughter should never be at war. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at them with absolute detachment. I told them that their tears were exactly 10 years too late. When the emotional manipulation failed to elicit a single ounce of sympathy, Thomas desperately pivoted to his final, most offensive tactic. He tried to play the respectability politics card. He straightened his posture, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former pastoral authority. He told me that by allowing them to face public ruin, I was betraying my own community. He stated firmly that I was destroying a prominent Black family and that the media would inevitably use this spectacular downfall against all of us. He demanded I protect our shared legacy from the hungry, judgmental eyes of the public. I stood up slowly, planting my hands flat on the polished surface of my desk. I leaned forward, bringing my face inches from his, and shut his manipulative garbage down permanently. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You destroyed this family when you chose a lying, thieving white con man over your own Black daughter just because he had a trust fund and a country club membership?" I stared directly into my mother's terrified eyes and reminded them both that they had happily traded my safety, my sanity, and my future for proximity to Julian's fake wealth and superficial privilege. They had eagerly sold out their own blood for a country club luncheon, and now they were choking on the bill. Thomas opened his mouth, but the sheer force of the truth rendered him completely speechless. Evelyn shrank back, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the center of the desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. I informed them that inside the envelope was a signed lease for a modest one-bedroom apartment in an unremarkable working-class suburb on the far side of the state. The rent was paid in full for exactly 12 months. I was also offering them a small, strictly rationed monthly stipend for basic groceries and utilities. It was a settlement born out of basic human decency, not love or obligation. However, the envelope contained one final non-negotiable catch. I tapped the thick stack of legal documents resting on top of the lease agreement. I explained that in exchange for the apartment and the stipend, they must immediately sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. They were legally barred from ever speaking to the press, publishing a book, or giving an interview about me, my companies, or the church scandal. Furthermore, they had to legally relinquish all claims to the family name in any public business or charitable capacity. They were to disappear into total permanent anonymity. I pushed a silver pen across the desk, pointing to the signature lines. I told them they had exactly 1 minute to sign away their pride and secure a roof over their heads, or they could walk back out into the street with absolutely nothing. Thomas's hands shook violently as he reached out and grabbed the silver pen resting on the desk. He did not bother reading the fine print of the non-disclosure agreement. The arrogant fight had been completely drained out of him. He signed his name, his once flamboyant and practiced signature reduced to a jagged, pathetic scrawl. Evelyn wept silently, adding her name right next to his, surrendering her beloved social identity and her unearned prestige forever. I summoned my security team and had them escort my former parents out of the building, instructing the guards to revoke their temporary access badges the second they cleared the lobby. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched them walk out of the glass doors, clutching their manila envelope banished to the obscure quiet and impoverished life they had always mocked. That dark chapter was permanently closed. However, there was still one final loose end remaining. 3 weeks later, my executive assistant forwarded a desperate email from a public defender's office. Chloe was currently out on bail awaiting her federal trial and had practically begged for a brief face-to-face meeting. I agreed, but I set the terms. I chose a dingy 24-hour roadside diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place where the linoleum floors were sticky and the air smelled heavily of stale fryer grease and cheap bleach. It was the exact opposite of the Michelin-starred restaurants and exclusive country clubs she used to demand I pay for. She walked through the battered glass door 10 minutes late. The transformation was startling and absolute. The golden child of the Oak Ridge elite was completely gone. Stripped of her stolen designer clothes, her expensive salon blowouts, and her diamond accessories, she looked hollow, exhausted, and remarkably ordinary. She wore faded, ill-fitting jeans and a plain gray sweater that swallowed her shrinking frame. The radiant arrogance that used to dictate her every movement had been replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. She slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, keeping her head down, refusing to make eye contact as a tired waitress dropped 2 chipped mugs of black coffee onto our table. Chloe wrapped her hands around the warm mug and immediately launched into her rehearsed routine. She did not start with an apology for the church fraud, the stolen source code, or the vicious lies she had spread to ruin my reputation. Instead, she painted herself as the ultimate victim of circumstance. She blamed Julian for manipulating her finances and keeping her in the dark about the offshore accounts. Then, with staggering hypocrisy, she blamed our parents. She claimed Evelyn and Thomas had aggressively groomed her to be materialistic, pushing her into a lifestyle she could not afford, and molding her into a monster. She insisted she was just a tragic product of their toxic environment, crying that she never had a chance to be a decent person because they had completely ruined her moral compass from childhood. I sipped my bitter coffee in silence, letting her exhaust her frantic excuses. Then came the real reason for the meeting. Chloe leaned across the sticky table, her voice dropping to a desperate, breathless whisper. She told me her public defender had explicitly stated that the federal judge would look highly favorably on her upcoming sentencing if she could prove she had stable, gainful employment and a strong familial support system. She begged for a job at Apex Dynamics. She promised she would scrub floors, answer the phones, or sort mail in the basement. She swore she had profoundly changed, that losing everything and sitting in a jail cell had finally humbled her. She just needed her successful, wealthy sister to throw her a lifeline so she would not be completely destroyed by the penal system. I looked at her tear-stained face, searching for a single ounce of genuine remorse, and found absolutely nothing. I saw only the terrified desperation of a lifelong narcissist facing tangible consequences for the very first time in her existence. She was not sorry for what she had done to me. She was just sorry she had been caught. I set my coffee mug down. I told her firmly that I would not hire her. I would not allow her toxic, parasitic presence within 100 miles of the company I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. Chloe gasped, her face twisting into a familiar mask of defensive anger, demanding to know how I could be so incredibly cruel and unforgiving to my own flesh and blood. She raised her voice, asking how I could just sit there and watch her go to prison when I had the power to save her. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and looked directly into her panicked eyes. "I forgive you, Chloe," I said calmly, my voice steady and unwavering. "But forgiveness means I will not carry the anger around anymore. It does not mean you get a seat at my table." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently as she realized there was no emotional manipulation left to try. The final bridge was burned to ash. I slid out of the vinyl booth and stood up, adjusting my coat. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a stack of crisp bills. I placed exactly $200 onto the sticky table right next to her coffee mug. I looked down at her stunned expression and reminded her that this was the exact amount she and Evelyn had tossed at me when they abandoned me stranded with nothing all those years ago. I told her to figure it out, turned my back, and walked out the diner door without looking back. Inside the federal detention center, Julian's initial shock had curdled into a vicious, cornered panic. Stripped of his bespoke tailored suits and forced into a standard issue orange jumpsuit, he quickly realized the federal prosecutors had absolutely no interest in offering him a lenient plea deal. They possessed a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, all meticulously compiled and handed over by my elite cybersecurity team. Facing decades in federal prison and the complete evaporation of his unearned privilege, Julian decided to play his final desperate card. He instructed his equally slimy defense attorney to reach out to a notorious sleazy tabloid journalist who was famous for publishing sensationalized corporate takedowns without ever bothering to verify a single source. Julian fed the eager reporter a completely fabricated, highly damaging narrative. He claimed that the core algorithm driving Apex Dynamics was not only stolen directly from his own defunct holding company, but was also intentionally riddled with illegal spyware designed to harvest and sell private user data to foreign entities. He delusionally thought he could leverage a massive public scandal to force my hand, hoping I would drop my cooperation with the federal authorities in exchange for his silence. The hit piece went live at exactly 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, splashed across the front page of the digital tabloid, with a glaring, scandalous headline designed for maximum destruction. The timing was entirely malicious and strategically calculated. Apex Dynamics was exactly 72 hours away from our highly anticipated initial public offering on the stock exchange. Within minutes of the article dropping, my office phone began ringing uncontrollably. My lead underwriters from the investment bank were in a state of sheer panic, threatening to halt the entire IPO process immediately. They warned me that institutional investors were already getting spooked by the severe allegations of stolen intellectual property and massive data breaches. The board of directors demanded an emergency closed-door meeting, terrified that Julian's desperate lies would vaporize billions of dollars in projected valuation before the stock market even opened. They frantically urged me to delay the public offering, suggesting we quietly settle with the tabloid and pay Julian off to make the story disappear and protect our assets. I walked into the chaotic boardroom, took my seat at the head of the polished glass table, and commanded absolute silence. I looked at the pale, sweating executives and told them that delaying the IPO would be a tacit admission of guilt, and I absolutely refused to negotiate with a cornered, indicted criminal. Instead of retreating into the shadows to draft a weak public relations statement, I unleashed my ruthless corporate legal team. By 9 in the morning, my lead counsel had filed a $300 million defamation and tortious interference lawsuit against both the tabloid publication and the specific journalist who authored the piece. We bypassed standard cease and desist letters entirely and went straight for their financial jugular. We served them with immediate aggressive injunctions and federal subpoenas, demanding all digital communications, emails, and financial transfers between their editorial staff and Julian's legal representation. The sheer speed, brutal precision, and devastating aggression of our legal response sent an immediate shockwave through the financial sector, proving instantly to the market that we had absolutely nothing to hide and everything to defend. I did not stop at a massive lawsuit. I knew the court of public opinion required a different kind of execution. At noon, I called a live televised press conference directly from the soaring glass lobby of the Apex Dynamics headquarters. I stood confidently before a sea of skeptical financial reporters and flashing cameras, completely ignoring the tabloid gossip and refusing to even say Julian's name. Instead, I used the massive platform to deliver a brilliant masterclass on corporate transparency and advanced cybersecurity. I projected real-time third-party audit results onto the massive digital screens behind me, irrefutably proving the original creation of our proprietary algorithms and demonstrating the impenetrable military-grade security protecting our user data. I calmly and methodically dismantled every single one of Julian's fabricated claims using hard, undeniable data and absolute poise. I challenged any tech analyst in the world to find a single flaw in our system, turning a potential scandal into the greatest marketing pitch of my career. By the time I stepped away from the podium, the narrative had entirely shifted. The financial markets did not see a fragile company in crisis. They saw an impenetrable fortress led by a visionary, unshakable CEO. The public confidence in my leadership skyrocketed instantly. The major institutional investors, thoroughly impressed by my aggressive crisis management, doubled their initial financial commitments by the end of the business day. Julian's pathetic attempt at blackmail had the exact opposite effect, ultimately driving our projected IPO valuation up by an unprecedented 30% and securing me billions more in capital. Julian watched my press conference on a small mounted television from his dreary holding block, the blood draining from his face as he realized his final attempt to destroy me had only made me wealthier and infinitely more powerful. His fabricated smear campaign had completely backfired, leaving him with a massive new defamation lawsuit to add to his already insurmountable mountain of federal fraud charges. He slumped onto his thin mattress, finally understanding that every move he made only tightened the noose around his own neck. Later that afternoon, his defense attorney visited him with even more devastating news, confirming that his luck had truly run out. The federal court had officially assigned the magistrate who would be presiding over his upcoming trial. It was the formidable Judge Harrison. She was a brilliant, no-nonsense black woman universally feared by corporate criminals and corrupt executives. She was famous throughout the entire federal circuit for handing down maximum sentences and having absolutely zero tolerance for arrogant, entitled white-collar con men who mistakenly thought their privilege put them above the law. Julian was not just going to prison. He was going to be made an absolute example of. The atmosphere inside the federal courtroom on the final day of the trial was thick with electric anticipation. Julian sat at the defense table, having successfully petitioned the court to swap his bright orange holding facility jumpsuit for a tailored charcoal gray suit. He was desperately attempting to project the illusion of the successful, untouchable aristocrat he once was. He sat with his shoulders pulled back, casually, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and flashing his signature perfectly white smile at the jury box whenever he thought Judge Harrison was distracted. He was playing the role of the charismatic, deeply misunderstood businessman to perfection. His entire demeanor was crafted to suggest that a man of his elite pedigree and breeding simply did not engage in the dirty pedestrian crimes he was being accused of. He leaned over to whisper confidently to his high-priced defense attorney, acting as though this entire legal proceeding was nothing more than a minor administrative mix-up that would inevitably be resolved in his favor. When the defense took the floor for their closing arguments, they launched a vicious, highly calculated character assassination aimed entirely at me. His attorney paced back and forth in front of the jury box, dramatically pointing a finger in my direction as I sat quietly in the front row of the gallery. He attempted to paint me as an aggressive, vindictive ex-relative suffering from a severe inferiority complex. He spun a fantastical, convoluted narrative claiming that I was a bitter, jealous woman who deeply resented Julian's generational wealth, his effortless charm, and his prominent social standing. The defense boldly suggested that I had orchestrated an elaborate, highly illegal frame job. They accused me of utilizing the vast resources of my advanced tech company to plant fake digital evidence, alter banking records, and fabricate the cyber espionage charges simply to destroy the man who had supposedly exposed my own corporate incompetence. It was a staggering masterclass in gaslighting, an audacious attempt to flip the script and make the predator look like the helpless prey. The prosecution did not even bother to raise their voices when it was their turn for rebuttal. The lead federal prosecutor simply walked over to the digital projector and systematically dismantled Julian's entire multi-million-dollar defense using the irrefutable cryptographic data trail my cybersecurity team had provided. They displayed the exact IP addresses and digital signatures linking the offshore wire transfers directly to Julian's personal smartphone. They played the crystal-clear, unedited audio recordings of his hysterical extortion attempts on the dark tarmac. They showed the encrypted metadata, proving he had personally authorized the theft of Apex Dynamics source code from his own home office. The sheer volume of hard, undeniable mathematical evidence completely suffocated the defense's emotional manipulation. The jury deliberated for less than 45 minutes before returning to the courtroom with a unanimous guilty verdict on every single count of wire fraud, extortion, and corporate espionage. The courtroom fell dead silent as Judge Harrison ordered Julian to stand for sentencing. She looked down at him from the elevated bench with an expression of absolute withering disgust. She did not yell, but her sharp, commanding voice cut through the silent room like a scalpel. She systematically tore apart his arrogant facade, stating for the public record that his actions were driven by nothing but unadulterated greed, toxic entitlement, and a pathetic, dangerous belief that the law did not apply to men born with trust funds. She made it abundantly clear that his attempts to smear a legitimate self-made business owner to cover his own spectacular failures were a profound insult to the justice system. Without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy, Judge Harrison brought her heavy wooden gavel down and sentenced Julian to 15 years in federal prison. She explicitly noted that due to the severe premeditated nature of the corporate espionage and extortion charges, the sentence would be served entirely without the possibility of parole. The color instantly drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking like a terrified hollow shell of a man. His knees buckled slightly as the crushing weight of a decade and a half behind bars finally shattered his delusional reality. Two armed federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing his arms and violently forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the quiet courtroom. As they forcefully turned him around to lead him toward the holding cells, he stopped resisting for a fraction of a second and desperately scanned the gallery. His panicked, wide eyes locked directly onto mine. I did not break eye contact. I sat perfectly still in the front row, crossed my legs, and slowly gave him the exact same condescending, arrogant smirk he had given me across the table at Thanksgiving dinner. Stepping out of the federal courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, the crisp air tasted like pure vindication. Julian was permanently erased from the board, locked away in a concrete box where his stolen privilege meant absolutely nothing. Yet as I settled into the back of my town car, the quiet hum of the engine reminded me that a crucial part of my grandfather's legacy was still bleeding. Thomas and Evelyn had allowed Julian to completely gut the congregation's pension fund, leaving hundreds of hardworking elderly parishioners facing total financial ruin. My parents had weaponized their faith to fund country club memberships and designer wardrobes, betraying the very people who had trusted them the most. Justice for Julian was only half the battle. I needed to heal the fracture he and my parents had left behind. I organized an emergency town hall meeting at the church sanctuary for the following Sunday afternoon. Walking through the heavy oak doors of the building where I had grown up, feeling entirely invisible, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Hundreds of parishioners packed the wooden pews, their faces etched with deep exhaustion and profound distrust. For decades, my mother and father had meticulously crafted a narrative that painted me as the ultimate family disappointment. They had poisoned this entire community against me, spinning elaborate lies about my supposed selfishness, my rejection of their faith, and my ruthless corporate greed. To the people sitting in these pews, I was not their savior. I was just the prodigal daughter who had callously orchestrated the public downfall of their beloved pastor and his perfect family. I could feel their hostile glares burning into my back as I walked down the center aisle. Whispers echoed off the stained glass windows, sharp and accusatory. They expected me to gloat over the ruins of their spiritual home, or worse, to announce the final foreclosure of the church building itself. I stepped up to the wooden pulpit, resting my hands on the worn brass railing. I did not bother with a prayer or a long-winded emotional preamble. These people had been manipulated by charismatic speeches for their entire lives. They needed facts, and they needed immediate action. I looked out over the sea of anxious faces and spoke with clear, uncompromising authority. I acknowledged their anger and their fear, validating the immense betrayal they had suffered at the hands of their trusted leaders. I told them I was not there to ask for their affection or to defend my own character. I was there to fix a broken system. I activated the large presentation screen behind the altar, projecting a certified bank transfer receipt. I informed them that my legal team had successfully traced and liquidated the offshore accounts Julian had used to hide their stolen money. A collective gasp rippled through the sanctuary as the numbers appeared on the screen in massive bold print. I had not just recovered a fraction of their lost savings, I had fully restored the church pension fund to the exact penny covering the legal fees and the lost interest out of my own pocket. I promised them that every single elderly parishioner would receive their scheduled retirement checks without a single day of delay. The heavy, hostile silence in the room instantly fractured. Women in the front rows began weeping, burying their faces in their hands. Men who had glared at me with absolute contempt were now staring at the screen in complete shock, realizing that their life savings had actually been salvaged from the wreckage. But I was not finished. Simply returning what was stolen was not enough to repair the generational damage my parents had inflicted on this community. I tapped a button on my tablet, bringing up a new slide displaying a vibrant, modern architectural rendering. I announced the immediate establishment of a comprehensive multi-million-dollar initiative dedicated entirely to the youth of the congregation. I called it the Big Mama Tech and Education Trust. I explained that this endowment would provide full college scholarships, advanced coding boot camps, and direct entrepreneurial grants to the young men and women in the community. My parents had spent years teaching these families to blindly obey authority and rely on empty promises. I was giving them the actual tools to build their own unshakable empires. Big Mama's legacy was finally going to be used to uplift and empower the people she had cared about, rather than funding the superficial vanity of a corrupt pastor and his greedy wife. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. The initial shock melted into an eruption of pure, unadulterated joy. The entire congregation rose to their feet in a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. The applause shook the wooden rafters, echoing with the kind of genuine, passionate reverence my parents had spent decades desperately trying to manufacture. Parishioners rushed toward the altar, their previous hostility completely evaporated, replaced by tears of profound gratitude. They shouted blessings, their voices blending into a powerful chorus of relief and restored hope. I stood at the pulpit, absorbing the incredible energy of the room, when a slight movement in the shadows at the very back of the sanctuary caught my eye. Standing just inside the vestibule doors, partially hidden by the heavy velvet curtains, were Thomas and Evelyn. They had snuck in, violating every term of their public exile, drawn back to the scene of their former glory, like moths to a flame. They stood frozen in their cheap, ill-fitting clothes, watching the spectacular scene unfold. They were forced to witness the absolute devotion, the thunderous applause, and the genuine love being poured over the daughter they had relentlessly discarded. I locked eyes with my father across the massive expanse of the church. I did not smile. I did not blink. I simply watched the utter devastation crush his spirit as he realized that the kingdom he had ruined was now thriving entirely without him, and I was the one wearing the crown. Leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the church behind, I drove the familiar winding roads toward the outskirts of town, heading to the one place that held the true heart of my family's history. Big Mama's house had been the battleground of my youth, a crumbling, drafty wooden Victorian structure where Evelyn and Thomas had constantly reminded me of my inadequacies. Now, as my tires crunched against the fresh gravel driveway, the property that greeted me was entirely unrecognizable. I had poured millions into a meticulous floor-to-ceiling restoration. The exterior maintained its beautiful historic wrap-around porch and original stained glass windows, meticulously preserved by master craftsmen. But beneath the heritage facade beat the heart of a cutting-edge, fully integrated smart home. The roof was lined with invisible solar tiles. The perimeter was secured by the same biometric defense systems I had designed for Apex Dynamics and the climate lighting, and security were entirely controlled by my proprietary artificial intelligence network. I had rebuilt my grandmother's legacy exactly the way I had built my life, respecting the roots while engineering an unbreakable future. I stepped onto the wide porch and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner concealed within the antique brass door handle. The heavy oak door clicked open instantly, with a soft, welcoming hum. I stepped into the grand foyer, the rich scent of polished mahogany and fresh paint filling my lungs. But as I walked down the central hallway, a sudden heavy wave of residual anxiety washed over me. This house was where the deepest scars of my childhood had been carved. I paused in the doorway of the formal dining room, the exact spot where Julian had mocked my first startup pitch while my parents laughed in agreement. I looked toward the foot of the stairs, remembering the countless times Evelyn had stood there coldly dissecting my appearance and telling me I lacked the grace required to be part of her elite social circle. For a fleeting second, the ghosts of their emotional abuse threatened to suffocate me. I could almost hear the echoes of their condescension bouncing off the newly plastered walls. I closed my eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and commanded the smart home system to illuminate the house. Instantly, warm golden light flooded the rooms, illuminating the stunning modern art on the walls and the sleek, custom-built furniture I had personally selected. I opened my eyes and looked around, realizing with absolute clarity that the ghosts were entirely gone. The toxic shadows that had haunted these halls for decades had been permanently exorcised. This was no longer a museum of my childhood trauma. I had bought the deed. I had gutted the rot. I had laid a new foundation. I stood in the center of the massive open-concept living room and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I had completely cleansed my life of their poison, and the silence in the house was no longer heavy with judgment. It was light, airy, and entirely mine. That evening, the house was filled with a different kind of noise. I hosted a private, intimate dinner party to christen the newly restored property. I did not invite blood relatives. I invited my chosen family. My lead software engineers, who had worked 80-hour weeks to build the Apex algorithm, sat laughing near the fireplace. My fierce legal counsel, who had utterly dismantled Julian in federal court, poured wine and swapped stories with my earliest mentors. These were the people who had seen my potential when I had nothing, the friends who had stood as an impenetrable shield when my biological family had tried to destroy me. We gathered around the massive live-edge dining table, a stark contrast to the sterile, hostile holiday dinners of my past. There were no backhanded compliments, no covert financial manipulations, and no conditional love. There was only genuine respect, shared triumphs, and the kind of loud, unapologetic joy that Thomas and Evelyn would have found entirely undignified. I looked down the length of the table, listening to the brilliant minds I had brought together, and raised my glass. We toasted to resilience, to unshakable loyalty, and to the future of the Big Mama Tech Trust. For the first time in my 34 years, I was sitting at the head of a table where I did not have to fight for my right to exist. The evening stretched into the late hours, the conversation flowing easily over coffee and dessert. Suddenly, a soft, digitized chime echoed from the smart home control panel mounted on the wall, signaling that someone was standing at the front gate. I frowned, setting my coffee cup down. My security perimeter was strictly geo-fenced. No one could even reach the front porch without prior authorization. I walked over to the panel and tapped the screen, bringing up the high-definition night vision feed from the gate camera. Standing in the glow of the security light, looking drenched from the sudden evening rain and thoroughly exhausted, was an unexpected figure. It was Brad, Julian's older brother and the aggressive corporate lawyer who had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to shield his brother from federal prison. My jaw tightened instinctively. I assumed he had come to hurl threats, to demand money, or to attempt some last-minute desperate legal maneuver to salvage his family's ruined name. I instructed my security team to remain on standby and walked to the front door, pulling it open with a cold, defensive glare, prepared for a fight. But as the door swung wide, Brad did not raise his voice. He did not threaten me. He simply stood there in the freezing rain, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, slowly raising his empty hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. Rainwater cascaded off the lapels of his ruined designer trench coat, pooling darkly on the pristine welcome mat I had laid out just that morning. Brad exhaled a long, ragged breath that materialized into a cloud of white vapor in the chill air. He slowly lowered his hands, reaching carefully into the inside breast pocket of his coat. My security detail instantly tensed their shadows, shifting visibly across the manicured lawn, but I held up a single finger, silently ordering them to stand down. I knew a broken man when I saw one. Brad withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope, wrapped in a protective waterproof sleeve. He held it out to me, his hand shaking slightly from a combination of the biting cold and undeniable humiliation. He told me that the envelope contained the finalized, notarized relinquishment of every single legal claim, civil suit, and frivolous appeal his family had attempted to file against me and Apex Dynamics. I did not reach for the envelope immediately. I let him hold it out in the freezing rain, forcing him to endure the agonizing weight of the moment. Brad swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the porch floorboards, before forcing himself to meet my gaze. He did not offer excuses or attempt to rationalize his brother's criminal behavior. Instead, his voice cracked as he delivered a raw, unvarnished apology. He confessed that his family had been blinded by generations of unchecked entitlement and toxic arrogance. They had looked at me and seen nothing but an easy target, a vulnerable stepping stone they could casually crush to elevate their own status. Brad admitted that their catastrophic underestimation of my intellect, my resilience, and my sheer willpower had cost them absolutely everything they valued. They had brought a sense of inherited superiority to a war of absolute survival, and they had been utterly decimated. He stated clearly that Julian was preparing to serve his full 15 years in isolation. Their holding company was entirely liquidated, and their vaunted family name was now permanently synonymous with federal fraud. I reached out and took the heavy envelope from his trembling fingers. I did not offer him a warm smile, a comforting platitude, or a single word of forgiveness. Forgiveness was a gift reserved for people who had genuinely tried to do the right thing and stumbled. Brad and his brother had maliciously plotted my destruction for their own financial gain. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that his family had finally received exactly what they had earned. I informed him that the transaction was now complete and that he was trespassing on my property. Brad gave a single curt nod of understanding. He turned his back, stepping off the porch and walking away into the torrential downpour, dissolving into the dark shadows of the street. I firmly gripped the brass handle and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The mechanical deadbolts instantly engaged with a satisfying heavy thud. The second the door closed, the howling noise of the storm was completely silenced, replaced by the warm melodic sounds of laughter and clinking crystal emanating from my dining room. I stood alone in the grand foyer for a moment, looking down at the legal documents in my hands. The very last domino had finally fallen. Every single enemy who had tried to steal my future had been systematically dismantled and vanquished. Every proprietary asset, every bank account, and every ounce of my grandmother's legacy was unequivocally secured. A profound, sweeping wave of absolute peace washed over me, settling deep into my bones. The frantic, desperate survival mode that had fueled my existence for the past 5 years evaporated, leaving behind a crystalline, unshakable certainty. I had won. I walked back into the vibrant warmth of the dining room. My brilliant lead engineers were passionately debating a new line of code, while my ruthless legal counsel was pouring another round of vintage Bordeaux for my mentors. None of them had even noticed my brief absence. They were entirely relaxed, completely safe within the fortress I had built. They represented my chosen reality, a circle of brilliant, loyal individuals who valued me for my intellect and my character, not for what they could extract from me. I did not mention Brad. I did not bring the toxic residue of the past into this sacred space. I simply placed the damp envelope on a side table, picked up a fresh, chilled glass of expensive vintage champagne, and slipped silently through the sliding glass doors. I stepped out onto the expansive back porch. The smart home sensors detected my movement, instantly activating the subtle ambient perimeter lighting and adjusting the overhead radiant heaters to ward off the chill of the rainy night. I walked to the edge of the glass railing and looked out over the glittering, majestic skyline of the city. The towering skyscrapers pierced the dark clouds, glowing with vibrant kinetic energy. I traced the illuminated skyline, knowing that my software, my algorithms, and my company were silently powering the infrastructure of the very city that lay before me. I was no longer the discarded scapegoat, the awkward disappointment, or the convenient victim. I was a titan. I had taken the brutal, shattered remnants of my childhood and forged them into an impenetrable empire. I raised my crystal glass high toward the endless rain-swept sky, offering a silent, reverent toast to Big Mama, to the brilliant future ahead, and to my own unyielding strength. I took a slow, savoring sip of the crisp champagne as a wide, triumphant smile broke across my face, the glowing city lights reflecting in my eyes as the world faded into perfect, peaceful black.